Hey guys, Ryan D'Agostino here with Achilles Heel Tactical, and today I'm going to show you how I choose to mount a scope personally. Now, you just went to the store, you bought your scope and your rings and your rifle, and you back home and you're probably YouTubing or Googling, how do I mount a scope? Well, there's a lot of different ways that you'll see people do or talk about how they mount a scope, but I'm just going to show you personally my favorite method of doing this. Okay guys, so my method here is running Short Action Customs final scope level and setting up a plumb bob, plumb line, whatever you want to call it, at about 50-ish yards. The distance doesn't really matter too much. It's just to where I can get far enough back to where I can get enough of the parallax out and get a good crisp image so I can see my crosshair in relation to the plumb line I have set up. The reason for the plumb line is so I can mount my scope with the reticle being true to gravity with that line. So I have a string with a little washer attached to the bottom of it to keep it there. Luckily there's no wind going on right now, so I don't have to worry about wobbling around. But I'll show you that and we'll give you a view through the scope at the end of it. This is a slower method of doing this, obviously, because I'm setting up a tripod. I have to level this base, which essentially becomes my rifle, instead of actually having the physical rifle. And then I have to set that up. But I really like this method because I know for a fact that my scope is now true to gravity. Is it needed? No. The other option is bubbles. So I prefer when I'm running this at classes because it's fast and it's typically good enough. So this is the Wheeler bubble set, and this one is their barrel vise mount option that they have. I'm a big fan of it because it's very portable and it gives me the ability to just slap it on any barrel and not have to worry about the contour or anything else or trying to get a flat surface to mount a bubble on. And this way, for students, for speed, for the sake of the class, I can get a good level. Now, something to be aware of if you're choosing to use bubbles, again, no problem. It's very, very efficient. You can even do it with this setup, not even needing a plumb line. But if you're gonna use bubbles, just be aware that temperature can affect the size of the bubble itself. So instead of trying to center it between the two lines that you'll see on the levels, I prefer personally to just favor one line or the other and run the edge of the bubble on that line. So something to be aware of if that's the route you choose to take. So as you guys can see here, I have the scope put in the rings in the base. I have the base installed on this. I made sure I leveled out the base, and I have the crosshair up and down perfectly on my plumb line right now. Now, some of you are probably wondering, why don't I have the scope perfectly centered in the rings? Like probably a lot of forums have told you you should or need to do. Well, that's not the case. You don't need to. What you don't want to do is go right up and bind where the scope bell comes into the main tube or anything like that, but I'm not quite there, so I have the entire main tube to work with. Now, why am I doing this? Well, I have a lot of experience with mounting scopes, which is why I also like doing this method. And instead of having it on a rifle where you think, oh, I need to set up my eye relief properly, I have a lot of experience doing this, so I already know that I want to favor the scope back because I have a Picatinny base. So what does that mean? It means that I have the ability, once I take this off and put this on the rifle, that now I can pick it up on the Picatinny rail on my rifle itself if I needed to go further. I know I don't need to because I've already mounted this scope before and numerous other scopes, and I know that this is where I like it. But what that comes down to is eye relief and exit pupil. So what's exit pupil? Well, exit pupil, if you stand far enough back from the scope, you see this little beam of light. And as you power up and power down, you'll see that beam of light grow and shrink. So that goes directly to the size of the objective lens that you have on your scope. It's not about gathering more light as most people are led to believe. Technically, it allows more in, sure, but it directly contributes to the size of the exit pupil, that hole. Let me expand further on that for you. The human eye restricts to, on average, about 3 millimeters, the pupil, restricts to about 3 millimeters on average in the middle of the day. It dilates to, on average, about 8 millimeters. So, the way you would know your exit pupil size is if you take your objective lens divided by in millimeters, divided by your magnification that you're on. That's going to tell you how big in diameter your exit pupil is. So an example would be if you had a 50 millimeter objective lens and you're on 10 power, 50 divided by 10 is 5, your exit pupil is going to be 5 millimeters in diameter. Well, what does that mean? In the middle of the day, let's say my pupil's at 2 millimeters, my pupil will fit inside that exit pupil and still have room to play. So that's my eye box, essentially, that you'll hear about. So that's what that's for. But same number, same situation. Now it's dark out. My pupil is at about 8 millimeters. Well, if my eye pupil is at 8 millimeters, but my exit pupil is only at 5, I will never have a perfectly clear field of view. I will still get some scope shadow, or vignetting is the technical term for it. So that's why I mount this back, because when you're setting up eye relief, we do this on max power. And the reason for that is the max power shrinks the exit pupil to its smallest point, and it also brings your eye relief closer to the scope. So if I favor it back, I just give myself more room to work with on any realm of power that I choose to go on. And again, even if it were too close, which I know this isn't, but even if it were, I can pick the whole mount up and move it on the Picatinny rail on the rifle. So that's why I prefer to do that. And it's just some food for thought for when you guys go to mount a scope. Okay, so some of you guys are probably seeing that I only have one ring on here, not two. Well, a lot of you guys have probably heard about the crisscross pattern when mounting your rings. That would be an accurate statement, but I'm gonna work smarter, not harder. So instead of now having to balance that between two different rings, I'm just gonna work on one, because then you can see the bubbles as you start to torque one side and do your cross patterning. You'll start to see the scope and the bubble wanting to go in a certain direction and bite. That's why you want to do even tension in a crisscross pattern, but just focus on one at a time. That way, when I finish this one, I can mount the second one up and it's not going to be moving the scope. Just makes my job easier. If you are choosing to run bubbles like the Wheeler set and you run one on your elevation turret, it's advised that you remove the cap completely and expose the internal mechanism of it, because that is what is truly perpendicular to the erector tube inside the scope, making your adjustments. Some scopes, you don't have that option. I know Vortex razors, they kind of have that, what I call an infinite wheel inside it, so you can't really get access to it. But if you have that option, it's just something else to worry about. Now, I'm gonna start putting my screws on in a cross-sectional pattern. I'm gonna start, this has 6 screws per ring, so total 12. I'm gonna start with the middles and work my way out. The reason for that is just peace of mind, because in case there's any inconsistencies in the metal, if I start my way in and work itself out, it's gonna essentially flatten out the metal. This is a spur mount in particular, super high quality, and it's a one-piece mount, which I'm a big fan of. So I know the tolerances are there, but better safe than sorry. If you have 2 individual rings, this is where you wanna set it up and favor it in a way, maybe bring them closer depending on how the scope is made. So that way it gives you that room to go back and forth, if that makes sense. So different things out there, but I prefer the Unimounts. My favorite is the spurs for sure. Now I'm gonna go ahead, put this first ring on, and I'm gonna install my 6 screws on this one, which I already filled them in right here, just to get it lined up. And I'm gonna go hand tight on all of them. I'm not gonna go against one side. I'm just gonna go back and forth slowly, taking my time, and just about finger tight, but not tight enough that the scope is locked in place. I want the rings to be more or less set, but still with enough play that I can move the scope and level it while it's still sitting in the ring. So I'm gonna start with the middle, like I said, and you may have noticed that I didn't even put Loctite on this. Well, why didn't you put Loctite on this? Good question. Reason for that is, one, the manual advises against it. And without getting too scientific with the reasons why, essentially, it can alter your torque spec when you're torquing these on for your final torque set. And you don't want to have a false reading when doing that. So that's why I don't put it on. Now, some of you guys may have bought some rings from your local gun shop, and you see that there's some thread locker on there. It's called Nylock. So if you're running that, that's fine. You don't need to remove that. Just go in and out several times with each screw to break that nylock up so it lays out evenly on the screw, and that's fine if you want to run that. But so you can see that I still have some wobble in this, no big deal. I'm just going back and forth, and we want even gaps on both sides of the ring. I go at a diagonal because this is at a diagonal, but if you guys are having straight horizontal ones, regardless of what it is, you want an even gap. So that way you know the torque and the force on the scope is being evenly distributed throughout the main tube body of the scope. So. So now I've got those on finger tight. I'm going back and forth, confirming with my plumb line that everything is leveled and confirming with bubbles. Just stay on top of it. Go back and forth, take your time. There's no rush doing this. Set it up right the first time so you don't have to go back after zeroing and then shooting, and then next thing you know, you're having issues. So now comes down to the torquing part. I have an even space in the gap between the top half and bottom half of the rings. Happy with that. Got all of them evenly distributed, about finger tight. Now I'm gonna torque them down. So how much do you torque them down? Average is about 15 to 18 inch-pounds is typically the average, but I would refer to the manual of the rings and the scope manual. Couple different trains of thought on this. Personally, I would not torque it any more than what the scope suggests, because then I can bind the internals of the scope. So for an example, if your rings say 20 inch-pounds, or your rings say 25 inch-pounds, but your scope says 20 inch-pounds, I'd probably start with the 20 inch-pounds. You can always call the scope manufacturer and be like, hey, my rings say 25, is that okay? I don't think you'll have any issues. Again, also if you run the Loctite as you're going to torque it, I've used it before and I've also had no issues, but it's just something to consider. So luckily for me, the spur suggests no more than 25 inch-pounds. Well, my scope also suggests no more than 25 inch-pounds. So I'm gonna go with 25 inch-pounds. These are fix-it sticks. I highly suggest you get yourself a pair. They're very mobile and you can take them to the range with you. One of the main things that I'll see if groups are opening up, other than it being poor fundamentals, is torque settings are off. Either the rings, the base, the actual physical base of your Picatinny rail onto the action receiver, or also the action screws underneath. So all things to be aware of. So now I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna start, like I said, middle and then crisscross pattern on my way out. Again, a little at a time. I don't need to go until it clicks. Just a little bit of pressure, and we just take our time doing this. There's no rush. The same pressure I'm putting on one screw, I'm putting on the exact opposing one. And we're just gonna keep going back and forth until eventually it wants to bite, torques completely. Now, even though I've torqued all the screws already once, I'm going back 2, 3, sometimes even 4 times, again, across all the screws again, because as I torque one of them down, I now buy more room for the next one, and so on and so forth. So you'll find that there's still play and you can still go once you've gone through all the screws. So go back several times until all of them officially stop moving. And that's what we're looking for. And then, as some of you guys may have noticed, I already have witness marks on these. And that's because I've already had this scope mounted. So I highly suggest though that you add witness marks to your screws so that way you can tell if they ever came undone. But we went ahead, got that first screw torqued down to the 25 inch-pound setting. I'm gonna go back, confirm that my bubbles are good and my reticle is true to the plumb line. Okay, so everything's lining up true with the plumb line. If it didn't though, what I would do is just loosen the screws a little bit at a time, just kind of loosen them up and repeat the processes, and this time just try and be a little bit more cautious on how evenly I'm distributing the torque on the screws. But now that's good to go. Got it all torqued down. I keep validating back and forth with the bubbles. This particular bubble level is a little bit of a pain. It's very slow adjusting, so I find myself having to keep stopping, going back and forth. But again, this is a patience game. This is a very accurate level. It's by Stare It, I forgot how you pronounce it, but it's what Short Action recommends as a quality bubble level for this. But I got that first ring torqued down, so now I'm gonna grab the second ring, and now I don't really even need to worry about, I'm still gonna try and be as evenly distributed with my pressures on each fastener as possible, but I don't need to be as anal about it because I've already secured the scope. That's why I said in the beginning, I recommend doing one ring half at a time. Okay, so we got everything torqued up as it should be. I'm going back and forth, checking the bubble, checking the plumb line, make sure everything's savvy. Now again, this is quite the process, but please take your time, make sure you get it as damn near perfect as you can possibly get it. Understand that there could be, with your plumb line, especially with yarn, there might be one part of the yarn that has a slight little bend to it. Try not to overthink it, just as perfectly centered as you can possibly get it. It's a process. You're probably gonna have to go back and forth, but make sure you do it right the first time. It'll pay dividends on the back end. So we'll go ahead, show you through the scope what it looks like now that I've got it all leveled up. I'm gonna adjust the elevation turret, so we'll watch the reticle go up and down the plumb line. You guys are gonna see a shadow on the left side of the string. Ignore that. I have the string that's half yellow and half black, so that's gonna be the main point. Okay, so let's go take a look. So I'm gonna dial up an elevation. That's gonna bring the reticle down. It's gonna pull and move as I'm adjusting, but you should still be able to make out that it's staying on the same track. And just back up. And again, as close as you can humanly possibly get it. So at this point, this is where you're gonna wanna put your anti-cant level on, or your bubble level as some call it. That's something to be aware of as well when you're putting your rings on, making sure you have the room for it. And this is where you would make sure that whole thing is leveled. Now, I'm not running a separate one, but the spur mount has one built in. Now, this is where you would also check, for me, running the spur, which I do because I'm actually cross-eye dominant. So if I open up my left eye, I'll see the bubble underneath the scope when I'm behind the gun. But I see that centered for the spur level is actually favoring a little bit more left inside between the two lines. That's completely normal. From numerous spurs I've seen, that's been the case. So something to just be aware of. All right guys, so there you have it. Scope's all done, mounted up. Now only thing left to do is put this on the rifle and then set the rifle up to us, which is coming to you guys in the next video. Length of pull, eye relief, cheek piece, all that. So stay tuned for that.